Welcome, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you.
You know what? It's been almost 6 months. What surprised you the most about this job?
It shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Just the busyness and the how interesting it is. It's constantly different challenges. I'll go from an interview with you here on a certain subject to a meeting with other people on something totally different next, and it's a constant, stimulation, digging into issues, meeting with people, hearing stories. There's a fullness to my days that I'm extraordinarily happy with, but it takes a lot out of you at the end of the day.
Well, now that we have you here, we've got a few things that I'd like to ask you about. You were in Montreal yesterday and you were talking about, your priorities for public transit. We'd like to know, first off, are you going to have any money for the rapid transit system to the West Island?
Oh, absolutely. What we announced yesterday was phase one, investments that can be made right away, which means renovating, upgrading, fixing problems with the existing public transit system to make sure that it's optimized so people it's more reliable, to make sure that it's running as smoothly as possible. That's $775 million or so over the next 3 years just for the Greater Montreal area. And phase two, which we're starting right now in terms of analyzing and bringing in proposals, is where we're talking about building more projects, whether it's light rail to the West Island, stopping through the airport, whether it's the light rail on the Champlain Bridge, whether it's extension of the Blue Line. These are the things that we're ready to be partners with when the proposals come forward from the city, from the province.
Is there a decision on Bombardier yet?
Bombardier, we're still working on it. The aerospace industry is really important for the Canadian economy, for the great jobs it has. We want to make sure that the decision we take, when we take a decision around Bombardier, whether to invest or not, it's done in a way that's going to support the company, not just for the short term through the challenges they have, but set up a strong, medium, and even a long term for Canada's aerospace industry.
What about home-to-home mail delivery? The people who have home-to-home mail delivery now, will they keep it?
We've put a pause on all the transformations that Canada Post is doing. We've brought in an external expert to review, to look at the whole of Canada Post to see what changes need to happen. I mean, obviously we know with technology, with email, with package delivery, there's huge changes in the delivery system. How do we continue to offer Canadians the service they require at a price that is affordable for Canadian taxpayers? And getting that balance right is something that requires consultation and reflection, things that the previous government wasn't very good at.
And people who've got community mailboxes now, will they get home-to-home back?
These are all things we're going to be looking at.
Legalizing marijuana, when's that going to happen?
It's going to happen soon. We know right now that young people in Canada have easier access to marijuana than just about any other developed country. The criminal gangs and organizations make billions of dollars a year off of the sale of marijuana. It's time to regulate it, control it, to better protect our kids, to better protect our communities, and that's what we're working on hard right now.
I'm going to read you something that's very familiar to you, I'm sure. It's a quote from your father. "The just society will be a united Canada, united because all of its citizens will be actively involved in the development of a country where equality of opportunity is ensured and individuals are permitted to fulfill themselves in the fashion they judge best." Is this part of his legacy that you want to continue? You're talking about, changing membership rules for political parties, electoral reform, Senate reform. What is it that you want to extend that was the essence of what he was saying back then?
Those are the values that I was raised with, but they're also the values that created modern Canada. And one of the contrasts with my father that people make is that he came in with a very clear set of sort of almost intellectual or academic priorities that he thought were essential, and he brought them in a very top-down way. Whether it was bilingualism, whether it was multiculturalism, whether it was changing, updating the Constitution, bringing in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I mean, that was something that he drove through a deep conviction and attachment to those values. Well, now, 30, 40 years later, we can come at those values in a more concrete way by saying, let's bring more people in. We don't have to be as top-down anymore. I mean, yes, you need leadership and vision to bring things forward, but great examples on the Syrian refugees. I mean, those values would say, let's make sure we're opening up Canada and welcoming people in, but in the 21st century, to succeed succeed in something like that, it's not just the government deciding we're going to welcome 25,000 Syrian refugees. It's communities, church groups, municipalities, provinces, all Canadians were involved in making this the initial success it is, and making sure that in the coming years it continues to be a success, that these new Canadians find the success that we all need them to have. This idea of engaged, active citizenship is at the center of what a modern democracy must be all about.
Because your father's call for a united Canada, multiculturalism, it's a lot more difficult now, though, isn't it?
I don't think it's more difficult now. On the contrary, I think people have seen how incredibly rich our communities and our society is. And indeed, as we look at some of the flashpoints and tensions around the world, whether it's in the electoral race south of the border or some of the challenges in Europe right now, we can look at our communities and say, wow, we've figured out how to make diversity a source of strength and not just a source of weakness. So where my father was looking at that from a sense that, yes, I know this is true and I'm going to demonstrate to people that it's true, we've now had 40 years of multiculturalism, 45 years of multiculturalism that has demonstrated that we really are stronger when we have greater diversity. And what I was able to put forward in cabinet, for example, of a cabinet that looks like Canada, gender parity, but also tremendous diversity, that doesn't just make people feel good that they're reflected in their government, but it actually leads to better decision making. The perspectives, the voices around the table are so much more diverse that we come at better solutions and fresh ways of looking at things than if you just had nothing but old white guys around the table, which was the way it used to be.
I've got to ask you about the burden of responsibility. You say you love your job, and you can show, we can see that you love your job. But on the other hand, you are now responsible for millions of people. And I was wondering, the night of October 19th, it's one thing to say you want to be Prime Minister. It's another to be sitting in that hotel room watching the results come in and suddenly coming to the realization that I'm going to be the next Prime Minister of Canada. And then what goes through your mind at that point?
But that that night when I admit my team was celebrating, I was already at work. I was on the phone with the President of Mexico talking about the new relationship we were going to build because the old one had been not so positive. That moment of the win on the night here at the Queen Elizabeth where we were wasn't that pivotal a moment for me, because for the past 3 years, everything that I'd been working on was not how do we position ourselves so we can win an election. It was very much how do we position ourselves so that we can govern the country right and bring forward the solutions. So there wasn't a sudden switch. Okay, now that I've won, what do we do? We were thinking about the investments, the changes that Canadians needed every step of the way through my life in politics. And it's the folks in Papineau who taught me that right here in Montreal, how to focus on their needs as a guide to everything else I do.
You still bear an incredible responsibility, though. Does it keep you up at night?
No, I mean,
you sleep well. That's good.
I sleep well. That's the thing. I'm one of the rules I have is 8 or 9 hours of sleep a night. Not every single night, but most nights a week I manage to get it, and that's how I have the energy to be able to do what it is that I have to do every day. But obviously, there's a tremendous amount of responsibility going on, and there are high expectations of me. But at the same time, I have really high expectations of Canadians, of our capacity to solve big challenges, to stick together, to create a better future for ourselves, for the next generations. There are a lot of people working together to build a better future for Canadians, and that's something that is really exciting to be part of.
But such high expectations. You worry about disappointing people?
Oh, listen, ever since I've been born, people look at how they feel about my father and project it onto me. So for the people who love me no matter what because of my father, I'm sure I can't meet those expectations. For people who hated me no matter what because of my father, I'm sure I'll exceed those expectations. So I'm going to disappoint a whole bunch of people equally on either side. How's that?
I'm thinking your children are about the same age now that you and your brothers were when your father was in power. Mm-hmm. When you're with your children, do you think about him? Do you wonder what he must have been thinking, looking at his children?
It occurs to me from time to time, but mostly if I'm going to be faithful to the way my father raised me, when I'm with my kids, I'm not thinking about anything else except my kids. I put aside the work concerns, I put aside, thinking about any historical perspective, and I just focus on being as active and engaged a dad as I possibly can. I mean, they're going through a difficult adjustment or a difficult experience, particularly now with social media, with the level of attention that comes around. But at the same time, I am uniquely positioned to be able to help them through what is going to be, yes, a challenging childhood on some levels, but an extraordinary opportunity for them to engage with the world and understand what responsibilities come with being lucky. And at the same time focus on doing for them what I was given by my parents, which are the tools to make sense of a world in which you're the Prime Minister's son, and that comes with a whole bunch of different baggage. So for my 3 kids, I focus on that.
Okay, so you're a Montrealer. I got to ask you about the Montreal Canadiens. So?
Listen, it was a heartbreaker of a year, particularly going to the U.S. and having Mr. Obama mock me so mercilessly about how my Habs were doing.
Prime Minister, can't you do something about this?
Yes,
no,
well,
really?
there are some levers I actually don't have, and we're certainly going to make sure that we support our team to hopefully have a better year next year.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out to come here and speak to us today, Mr. Prime Minister.
Real pleasure, Mutsumi.